And good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you may be around the world. I am Marcus Holmes, and I am bringing you yet another Black History moment. Um, Love and Stuff community, which we are broadcasting from today, streaming from today, rather, via Restream on the Love and Stuff page, the Marcus R. Holmes page on Facebook, the Marcus R. Holmes page on LinkedIn Live, along with Twitch TV and YouTube events, the HR Passion Guy, to bring you Black History moments for every day this month, including the weekends. And we are excited to share with you moments of sacrifice, moments in history, excellent people, people in the struggle, in the African American diaspora. Love and Stuff is a wonderful community that has reach across the globe, thankfully, wonderfully. But we also wanted to highlight an important part of our history. Though I am 365 Black, I wanted to highlight all of those forefathers and mothers and ancestors, heroes sung and unsung in our very colorful and collective history. And so, moving into next week, we're going to move into highlighting some of the writers and writings of individuals across the African American diaspora. And tonight, because one of those heroes would have had a birthday passed at the beginning of the Black History Month, I wanted to close out this week, looking forward into the next week, with Langston Hughes. And I'm just going to share a few of the Langston Hughes pieces and a little bit about Langston Hughes' background. This piece, of course, is probably one of the most familiar of his pieces that I will share, and I will share some of the analysis that have been written relative to this piece. It is "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. And there has been a lot of analyses of this poem, and some of the people hear it in summary this way: I have been familiar with a lot of rivers. I have been familiar with rivers that are as old as the planet itself, older than blood pumping through people's veins. My soul has become deep, very deep, just like the rivers I know. I went swimming in the Euphrates rivers when human civilization was still young, and even sunrises were new. I built my home near the Congo River, and its murmuring waters helped me fall asleep. I saw the Nile and helped build the pyramids on its shore. And I heard the Mississippi River sound as if it were singing when Abe Lincoln traveled on it to New Orleans. And I've seen the surface of that muddy river, like a person's chest, reflect the sunset, turning gold. I've been familiar with a lot of rivers, very dark, very old rivers. My soul has become very deep, just like the rivers I know. The Negro Speaks of Rivers stretches from the early moments of human civilization all the way to American slavery, emphasizing that Black people have both witnessed and participated in the key moments of human history. In the face of centuries of slavery and oppression in America, the poem's speaker asserts the perseverance of Black cultural roots. The poem argues that people of African descent have not simply been present for all of human history, they have been a guiding force shaping civilization. In this sense, the poem is an ode to Black perseverance. The speaker of the poem acts as a representative figure. After all, the title is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, not a Negro. In this sense, the speaker models how he or she thinks the Black community as a whole should relate to its culture and history. As almost a mythical figure, the speaker emphasizes the depth of his or her experience, which turns out to represent the entire history of Black people. The speaker has known ancient as the world and bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. In fact, the speaker has known rivers older than the flow of human blood in human veins, so suggesting that Black existence was even before human existence. As the speaker outlines these distant, disparate experiences, he or she stresses that they are not disconnected events. They form one uninterrupted experience, like a river. Rivers represent continuity. They cannot be chopped up into discrete chunks. But that was a fitting observation of this great poem. James Mercer Langston Hughes, February 1st, 1901 through May 22nd, 1967. He was an American poet, social activist, novelist, playwright, and columnist from Joplin, Missouri. One of the earliest innovators of the then new literacy art form, jazz poetry. Hughes is best known as a leader of the Harlem Renaissance, and that piece that we just read was famously and critically acclaimed, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. He famously wrote about the period that the Negro was in vogue, which was later paraphrased as when Harlem was in vogue. Growing up in a series of Midwestern towns, Hughes became a prolific writer at an early age. He moved to New York City as a young man, where he made his career. He graduated from high school in Cleveland, Ohio, and soon began studies at Columbia University in New York City. Although he dropped out, he gained notice from the New York publishers, first in the Crisis magazine, and then from book publishers, and became known in the creative community in Harlem. He eventually graduated from Lincoln University. In addition to poetry, Hughes wrote plays and short stories. He also published several nonfiction books. From 1942 to 62, as the civil rights movement was gaining traction, he wrote an in-depth weekly column in a leading Black newspaper, the Chicago Defender. I want to read another one of his pieces, a very familiar piece, I Too. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. One of my favorites from Langston Hughes. Like many African Americans, Hughes had a complex ancestry. Both of Hughes' paternal great-grandmothers were enslaved Africans, and both of his paternal great-grandfathers were white slave owners in Kentucky. According to Hughes, one of these men was Sam Clay, a Scottish-American whiskey distiller of Henry County, said to be a relative of statesman Henry Clay. The other was Silas Cushenberry, a Jewish-American slave trader of Clark County. Hughes' maternal grandmother, Mary Patterson, was of African-American, French, English, and Native American descent. One of the first women to attend Oberlin College. She married Lewis Sheridan Leary, also of mixed race, before her studies. Lewis subsequently joined John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in West Virginia in 1859, where he was fatally wounded. 10 years later, in 1869, the widow Mary Patterson Leary married again into the elite, politically active Langston family. Her second husband was Charles Henry Langston, of African American, Euro American, and Native American ancestry. He and his younger brother, John Mercer Langston, worked for the abolitionist cause and helped lead the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society in 1858. After their marriage, Charles Langston moved with his family to Kansas, where he was active as an educator and activist for voting rights for African Americans. His and Mary's daughter, Caroline, known as Carrie, became a school teacher and married James Nathaniel Hughes. They had 2 children. The second was Langston Hughes, born in 1901 in Joplin, Missouri. His father left the family soon after he was born and later divorced Carrie. The senior Hughes traveled to Cuba, then Mexico, seeking to escape the enduring racism in the United States. After the separation, Hughes' mother traveled seeking employment, and Langston was raised mainly in Lawrence, Kansas by his maternal grandmother, Mary Patterson Langston. Through the Black American oral tradition and drawing from the activist experiences of her generation, Mary Langston instilled in her grandson a lasting sense of racial pride. Imbued by his grandmother with a duty to help his race, Hughes identified with neglected and downtrodden Black people all his life and glorified them in his work. He lived most of his childhood in Lawrence. In his 1940 autobiography, The Big C, he wrote, "I was unhappy for a long time and a very lonesome living with my grandmother. Then it was that books began to happen to me, and I began to believe in nothing but books and the wonderful world in books, where if people suffered, they suffered in beautiful language, not in monosyllables, as we did in Kansas." After the death of his grandmother, Hughes went to live with family friends, James and Auntie Mary Reed, for 2 years. Later, Hughes lived again with his mother, Carrie, in Lincoln, Illinois. She had remarried when he was an adolescent. The family moved to the Fairfax neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio, where he attended Central High School and was taught by Helen Maria Chestnut, whom he found inspiring. His writings began when he was young. While in grammar school, he was elected class poet. He stated that in retrospect, he thought it was because of the stereotype about African Americans having rhythm. "I was a victim of stereotype," he says. "There were only 2 of us Negro kids in the whole class, and our English teacher was always stressing the importance of rhythm in poetry. Well, everyone knows, except us, that all Negroes have rhythm, so they elected me as class poet." Unquote. During high school in Cleveland, Hughes wrote for the school newspaper, editing the yearbook, and began to write his first short stories and dramatic plays and poetry. His first piece of jazz poetry, When Sue Wears Red, was written while he was in high school. Hughes worked at various odd jobs before serving a brief tenure as a crewman aboard the SS Malone in 1923, spending 6 months traveling to West Africa and Europe. In Europe, Hughes left the SS Malone for a temporary stay in Paris. There he met and had a romance with Anne Marie Cowsey, a British educated African from a well-to-do Gold Coast family. They subsequently corresponded, but she eventually married Hugh Wooding, a promising Trinidadian lawyer. Wooding later served as Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. During his time in England in the early 1920s, Hughes became part of the Black expatriate community. In November 1924, he returned to the U.S. to live with his mother in Washington, D.C. After assorted odd jobs, he gained white-collar employment in 1925 as a personal assistant to historian Carter G. Woodson and at the Association for the Studies of African American Life and History. As work demands limited his time for writing, Hughes quit the position to work as a busboy at the Wardman Park Hotel. Hughes' earlier work had been published in magazines and was about to be collected in his first book of poetry when he encountered poet Vachel Lindsay, with whom he shared some poems. Impressed, Lindsay publicized his discovery of this new Black poet. I want to share with you another of his poems, one of my favorite. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust over and sugar over like syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? Some academicians and biographers believe that Hughes was homosexual and included homosexual codes in many of his poems, as did Walt Whitman, who Hughes said influenced his poetry. Hughes' story, Blessed Assurance, deals with a father's anger over his son's effeminacy and queerness. The biographer Aldrich argues that in order to retain the respect and support of Black churches and organizations and avoid exacerbating his precarious financial situation, Hughes remained closeted. Arnold Rapper said, the primary biographer of Hughes, determined that Hughes exhibited a preference for African American men in his work and life, but in his biography, Rampersad denies Hughes' homosexuality and concludes that Hughes was probably asexual and passive in his sexual relationships. Hughes did, however, show a respect and love for his fellow Black man and woman. Other scholars argue for his homosexuality. His love of Black men is evidenced in a number of reports unpublished poems to an alleged Black male lover. I'm going to talk a little bit about his relationship with his father. Hughes had a very poor relationship with his father, whom he seldom saw when he was a child. He lived briefly with his father in Mexico in 1919. Upon graduating from high school in June 1920, Hughes returned to Mexico to live with his father, hoping to convince him to support his plan to attend Columbia University. Hughes later said that prior to arriving in Mexico, quote, I had been thinking about my father and his strange dislike of his own people. I didn't understand it because I was a Negro and I liked Negroes very much, unquote. His father had not supported his desire to be a writer. His father had hoped Hughes would choose to study at a university abroad and train for a career in engineering. On these grounds, he was willing to provide financial assistance to his son, but did not support his desire to be a writer. Eventually, Hughes and his father came to a compromise. Hughes would study engineering so long as he could attend Columbia. His tuition provided, Hughes left his father after more than a year. While at Columbia in 1921, Hughes managed to maintain a B-plus average. He left in 1922 because of racial prejudice among students and teachers. He was attracted more to the African American people and neighborhood of Harlem than to his studies, but continuing to write poetry, Harlem was a center of vibrant cultural life. First published in 1921 in The Crisis, the official magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, The Negro Speaks of River, which became Hughes' signature poem. It was collected in his first book of poetry, The Weary Blues, 1926. Hughes' first and last published poems appears in The Crisis. More of his poems were published in The Crisis than in any other journal. Hughes' life and work were enormously influential during the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, along those of his contemporaries, Zora Neale Hurston, Wallace Thurman, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Richard Bruce Nugent, and Aaron Douglas. Except for McKay, they worked together also to create the short-lived magazine Fire, devoted to younger Negro artists. Hughes and his contemporaries had different goals and aspirations than the Black middle class. Hughes and his fellows tried to depict the low life in their art, that is, the real lives of Blacks in the lower socioeconomic strata. They criticized the division and prejudices within the Black community based on skin color. Hughes wrote what would be considered their manifesto, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, published in The Nation in 1926. He writes, "The younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful and ugly too. The tom-tom cries and the tom-tom laughs. If colored people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves." His poetry and fiction portrayed the lives of the working class, Blacks in America, lives he portrayed as full of struggle, joy, laughter, and music. Permeating his work is pride in the African American identity and its diverse culture. He writes, quote, "My seeking has been to explain and illuminate the Negro condition in America and obliquely that of all humankind," unquote. Hughes is quoted as saying, "He confronted racial stereotypes, protested social conditions, and expanded African America's image of self, a poet's poet who sought to re-educate both audience and artist by lifting the theory of the Black aesthetic into reality. The night is beautiful, so the faces of my people. The stars are beautiful, so the eyes of my people. Beautiful also is the sun. Beautiful also are the souls of my people." Written in 1923 in The Crisis by People. Hughes stressed a racial consciousness and cultural nationalism devoid of self-hate. His thought unified people of African descent in Africa across the globe to encourage pride in their diverse Black folk culture and Black aesthetic. Hughes was one of the few prominent Black writers to champion racial consciousness as a source of inspiration for Black artists. In 1930, his first novel, Not Without Laughter, won the Harmon Gold Medal for Literature. At a time before widespread arts grants, Hughes gained the support of private patrons, and he was supported for 2 years prior to publishing his novel. The protagonist of the story is a boy named Sandy, whose family must deal with a variety of struggles due to their race and class, in addition to relating to each other. In 1932, Hughes and Ellen Winter wrote a pageant to Caroline Decker in an attempt to celebrate her work with the striking coal miners of the Harlan County War, but it was never performed. It was judged to be a long, artificial propaganda vehicle, too complicated and too cumbersome to be performed. Hughes' first collection of short stories was published in 1934, The Ways of White Folks. He finished the book at Carmel, California cottage provided for a year by Noel Sullivan, another patron. These stories are a series of vignettes revealing the humorous and tragic interactions between whites and blacks. Overall, they are marked by a general permission about race relations, as well as a sardonic realism. He also became an advisory board member to the then newly formed San Francisco Workers' School, later the California Labor School. In Chicago, Hughes founded the Skyloft Players in 1941, which sought to nurture Black playwrights and offer theater from the Black perspective. Soon thereafter, he was hired to write a column for the Chicago Defender, in which he presented some of his most powerful and relevant work, giving voice to Black people. The column ran for 20 years. In 1943, Hughes began publishing stories about a character he called Jesse B. Simple, often referred to and spelled Sample, the everyday Black man in Harlem who offered musing on topical issues of the day. Although Hughes seldom responded to requests to teach at colleges, in 1947, he taught at Atlanta University. In 1949, he spent 3 months at the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools as a visiting lecturer. Between 1942 and 1949, Hughes was a frequent writer and served on the editorial board of The Common Ground, a literary magazine focused on cultural pluralism in the United States, published by the Common Council for American Unity. He wrote novels, short stories, plays, poetry, operas, essays, and works for children. With the encouragement of his best friend and writer, Arna Bontemps, and patron and friend, Carl Van Vechten, he wrote 2 volumes of autobiography, The Big C and I Wonder as I Wander, as well as translating several works of literature into English. With Bontemps demonstrates talent to the point where one questions the necessity, other than for its social evidence, of the specialization of Negro in the title. From the mid-50s to the mid-60s, Hughes' popularity among the younger generation of Black writers varied, even as his reputation increased worldwide. With gradual advance toward racial integration, many Black writers considered his writings of Black pride and its corresponding subject matter out of date. They considered him a racial chauvinist. He found some new writers, among them James Baldwin, lacking in such pride, over-intellect in their work, and occasionally vulgar. On May 22nd, 1967, Hughes died in New York City at the age of 67 from complications related to prostate cancer. His ashes are interred beneath a floral medallion in the middle of the foyer in the Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. It is the entrance to an auditorium named for him. The design on the floor is an African cosmogram entitled Rivers. The title is taken from his poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Within the center of the cosmogram is the line, "My soul has grown deep like the rivers." This has been a Black History Moment. I am so glad that you joined me for this moment. We will have Black History Moments every day for the balance of the month at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And beginning tomorrow, this is the formal start of our look at writings, various literary works of those within the African American diaspora and experience. And we will have guests on board with us this week. You will hear other voices sharing writings, some of them poets, some of them from every walk of life. And I hope that you will join us. I hope that you will click share and that you will set your calendars to know that there will be a moment in Black history every day in the Love and Stuff community. Thank you so much for watching. We hope to see you on this journey this month. On the 28th, we will close out with a culmination show that will happen that evening at 6 p.m. And on Valentine's, go to the Love and Stuff page. There is a very special event happening on Valentine's afternoon that includes some cinema. That's right, some movies right here live that will include some opportunity to win prizes, some great poetry, and some good music. We'd love to have you as our very special guest on Valentine's Day, February 14th at 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm Marcus Holmes, the facilitator of Love and Stuff and the HR Passion Guy. Thank you for tuning in and have a grateful weekend. Just checking across platforms. Good evening, Mahasan and Karen, and folks that are on YouTube events and folks that are on LinkedIn Live. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you will join us tomorrow and the days to come for great celebrations in Black history.